There is a town on the coast of a fictional stretch of the American East Coast that doesn't exist on any real map, but you probably know it like a neighborhood you grew up in. The boardwalk, the lighthouse on the hill, the pizza shop run by a family who seems to exist in a perpetual state of mild worry, the donut shop where the same two teenagers have worked for what feels like decades. And at the far end of the beach, attached to a cliff face that juts out over the water, a temple with two faces carved into it, one gentle, one fierce, staring out over the ocean toward wherever the horizon decides to end. Beach City, the most quietly extraordinary place in animation history. Steven Universe ran on Cartoon Network from November 2013 through January 2019, 5 seasons, a feature film in 2019, and a short epilogue series called Steven Universe Future that wrapped up in March 2020. Rebecca Sugar created it, led it, wrote much of it, composed much of its music, and left her specific fingerprints on virtually every frame. She was the first solo female creator in Cartoon Network's history, a fact that matters not as a statistic but because of what it meant in practice. This show had a single sustained vision, guiding it across 7 years of television. That's rare. And it shows. The show is, on the surface, about a chubby, half-human boy with a magical gem in his belly, who lives with 3 ancient alien warriors and goes on adventures. That's the pitch. That's the sentence that got it greenlit. What the show actually became, across its run, is something considerably harder to put in a pitch meeting. It became a deeply personal exploration of inheritance, grief, identity, the generational cost of silence, and the radical proposition that empathy is not a weakness but the most powerful force in any universe. It became, for a lot of people who were watching it during the years it aired, the show that made them feel seen in ways other shows hadn't managed. But what we're here for tonight or this morning or whatever hour finds you with your eyes growing heavy and the world quiet around you is the lore, the deep lore. The stuff embedded in the background art and the musical leitmotifs and the characters whose stories the show told across 5 seasons without ever quite finishing them, not because it ran out of interest, but because some stories don't have neat endings. The stuff you can watch a dozen times and still find something new in. The stuff that sits with you afterward in the particular way that only the best storytelling does. We're going to move slowly tonight. There's no rush. The whole show is right there whenever you want to revisit it, and we're going to walk through what makes it the kind of place worth revisiting at all. We'll go through the history of the Gem civilization, the full arc of Pink Diamond, Pearl's extraordinary and complicated devotion, how Garnet's existence changed the course of a war, Lapis Lazuli and what it means to be collateral damage in someone else's conflict, the corrupting light, and the math of a tragedy that can't be fully accounted for, the music that carries the lore between the lines of dialogue, and what the show ultimately said about what it costs to grow up carrying other people's choices. So settle in, get comfortable. Let the ocean sound play in your mind, if it helps. Beach City's always there. Before we go anywhere else, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing where these videos find people, whether it's 2 in the morning in a cold room somewhere, or noon on a Tuesday when you just needed to disappear for a while. And if this is the kind of video you come back to, hit subscribe. There'll be more where this came from. Part 1. The Foundations of Homeworld. How an Empire is Built from Stone. To understand anything that happens in Steven Universe, any of the grief, the rebellion, the betrayal, the long, slow reconciliation, you need to understand Homeworld first. Not the homeworld of the show's present, which by the time we see it is already a civilization in the early stages of something it doesn't have a word for yet, but the homeworld of the deep past. The homeworld that built the machine that nearly destroyed the Earth. Gem Homeworld is a planet somewhere across the galaxy, and the specifics of its location don't matter much because the show was never really about astronomy. What matters is what it represents. A civilization that has spread itself across hundreds of planetary bodies through a process of colonization so thorough and so destructive that the planets it leaves behind are essentially dead, drained, used up. The resources extracted, the organic life destroyed as a matter of course, the rock itself hollowed out for the gems that grew in the kindergartens carved into it. The kindergartens are worth understanding because they're one of the show's most quietly disturbing ideas. When Homeworld wants to grow new gems, new soldiers, new workers, new servants, it finds a suitable planet and carves massive injection sites into its surface. These injectors, enormous structures that look like mechanical roots, drive deep into the planet's crust and begin extracting the organic material that makes the world living, its nutrients, its minerals, its capacity to sustain life. Gems gestate within the rock over what can be years or centuries, absorbing everything they need from the planet around them. When they're ready, they emerge. They step out of the rock fully formed, already knowing their function, already oriented toward their purpose. The planet, after this process, is changed permanently. The land around a kindergarten is dead. The soil doesn't recover. The organic life that existed before the injectors arrived doesn't come back. Earth has two known kindergartens, the Prime Kindergarten and the Beta Kindergarten. And the episodes that take place there are among the most visually stark in the series. Pale rock, dead trees, a landscape that looks like it was interrupted mid-sentence and never got to finish. This is what colonization costs in the show's universe. New gems for an expanding civilization at the price of whatever the planet was before. Now, the gem civilization is stratified in a way that makes many human class systems look subtle by comparison. Every gem type has a designated function, and that function determines essentially everything about its existence: where it goes, what it does, who it serves, what it's allowed to be. Rubies are soldiers, small and common and generally deployed in groups. Pearls are attendants, created to serve higher-ranking gems, considered more as accessories than as individuals. Sapphires are rare oracles with future vision, aristocratic by nature of their scarcity. Peridots are technicians and engineers. Bismuths are builders. Jaspers are elite soldiers, grown large and powerful, the kind of gem armies want on their front lines. And at the top of this entire structure, ruling over everything and everyone, are the diamonds. The hierarchy is rigid in a way that causes real harm to nearly every gem who exists within it. The gem who doesn't match the expected profile of their type is considered defective, and being considered defective on Homeworld has consequences ranging from social exclusion to execution by dedicated robonoids that patrol looking for gems who don't meet specification. The off-colors gems like fluorite, rhodonite, padparadscha, and the rutile twins, who appear later in the series, have spent what seems like centuries hiding underground in abandoned tunnels to avoid being shattered for the crime of existing in shapes and forms the system never planned for. This is a civilization built entirely around the principle that there is a right way to be, and that anything outside that right way is a problem to be corrected or removed. Rebecca Sugar and her team use this as the foundation for practically every character arc in the show, because the question of what happens when you exist in a way the system wasn't designed for is, of course, not a question exclusive to alien gem civilizations. White Diamond sits at the top of everything. She barely appears in the series until the final arc of Season 5, and her absence before that point is itself a form of characterization. Other gems speak of her with something that edges toward fear, the way you might speak about weather patterns you can't control. She is the authority behind the authority, the perfection that the entire system claims to be oriented toward. When she finally appears, she is drawn in a style slightly different from every other gem in the show, more monochrome, more sharply rendered, more uncomfortably realistic in her expressions. Her power dwarfs everyone else's. She can project her consciousness into other gems and control them completely. She can override a gem's entire sense of self. And where did she come from? The show doesn't say. The timeline available through various supplementary materials like the Steven Universe, End of an Era book, which the show's creators have noted is not entirely canonical but likely contains some accurate material, suggests that White Diamond constructed Homeworld society, created the caste system, banned cross-gem fusions, and established the punishments for gems who weren't deemed flawless. She led the Diamond Authority in colonizing planets. But what existed before White Diamond established all of this is left entirely undefined. Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond operate beneath White and above everything else. They are more present in the show, more fleshed out through interaction, more humanized across the series. Yellow is the military arm, the efficiency engine, the diamond who manages conquest and production, and is visibly impatient with anything that slows the process. Blue is something more like the emotional center of the authority, a diamond associated with culture and memory, and a grief so overwhelming it literally bleeds into the people around her. Her sorrow is atmospheric, contagious, impossible to be near without feeling. Both of them have lost Pink Diamond, the youngest and lowest-ranked member of the Authority, and both of them have spent thousands of years processing that loss in different and equally dysfunctional ways. Pink Diamond's story is where everything starts to fall apart and come back together. We'll spend more time on her in the next section. But for now, understand that the world she was born into, the civilization she was created as part of, is a machine designed to expand forever at the cost of whatever stands in its way, justified by a philosophy of perfection that admits no alternatives. This is the system that the Crystal Gems Rebellion was pushing back against. This is the context in which every choice the show's characters make becomes meaningful. The Gem Empire, at its height, had colonized over 43 planetary bodies and 2 star systems. The homeworld that Steven Universe eventually reaches during the 5th season trial arc is a planet that has literally consumed itself to sustain the Empire the homeworld mined for its own gems, the civilization that fed on its own foundation. This detail sits in the background of the Season 5 storyline like a quiet accusation. What does it cost to maintain perfection? And who pays that cost? The answer the show gives, eventually, is that the cost is paid by everyone except the people at the top. And that the people at the top had convinced themselves this was the natural order of things so thoroughly that most of them had stopped seeing it as a cost at all. That is the world the Crystal Gems rose up against. That is the civilization Steven inherits a complicated relationship with. And that is the infrastructure of harm that the series spends 5 seasons, a film and a miniseries slowly, carefully, and humanely taking apart, one piece at a time. Starting with a girl in a garden, playing a game with someone who had just been built to play with her. Part 2. Pink Diamond. The most important liar in the universe. Here is what Pink Diamond looked like before she became anyone else. She had bubblegum pink skin and pale pink hair and diamond-shaped pupils in her deep pink eyes, and she was smaller than the other, diamonds smaller by enough that it was consistently remarked upon, a source of both actual diminutive standing in the hierarchy and something more like social smallness, the specific quality of never quite being taken seriously. She was playful and excitable and desperate to be included, and she existed for a long time as the youngest member of an authority that included her mostly on sufferance. Pink wanted a colony. That was her stated desire for what seems like a significant portion of her early existence. The chance to do what the other diamonds did, to colonize a planet, to grow her own gems, to prove she was worth the space she took up in the diamond hierarchy. Yellow and blue and white dismissed this repeatedly. She wasn't ready. She was too immature. She wasn't capable of managing a colony responsibly. The show gives us a glimpse of this dynamic through a flashback episode called Jungle Moon, seen through Stevani's dream Pink as a child, essentially. Throwing a tantrum in Blue's presence about wanting her own colony, Blue radiating exhaustion, the exchange between them having the particular flavor of a conversation that's happened many times before. Eventually, Pink was given Earth. The planet had been identified as suitable for colonization, rich in organic material, geologically diverse, with a surface that could support kindergartens. Pink arrived with Pearl and began the process of building a colony. She established a moon base on Earth's satellite to monitor progress. She commissioned a prime kindergarten in the cliff faces of what would become North America. Gems began to emerge. The work was beginning. And then Pink Diamond went to look at the actual Earth. It's Pearl's idea. Initially not to go look, but to find a way for Pink to do something she wanted, without getting in trouble for it. Pink was bored of the formal nature of being a diamond, bored of watching gems she couldn't freely interact with, bored of the distance that her status imposed between herself and the planet she was supposed to be colonizing. She wanted to go down and see the kindergarten gems, talk to them, exist alongside them the way she couldn't as herself. Pearl, trying to make her diamond happy as Pearl had always been trying to make Pink Diamond happy, suggested that Pink could shapeshift. Disguise herself as a rose quartz, a common type of quartz soldier being grown in the prime kindergarten, and no one would know the difference. Pink thought this was a wonderful idea. She shapeshifted, adjusted her gemstone's position to match a rose quartz's placement, and went down. The official homeworld history of this moment, the story that every gem has been told, is that a rose quartz soldier who was grown in the prime kindergarten began to question her mission. began to love the organic life on Earth, began to wonder whether the planet deserved to live, began to rebel. This is the founding myth of the crystal gems rose quartz, a common soldier who looked at the beautiful, alive, complicated world around her and decided it was worth fighting for, even when fighting for it meant fighting against her own civilization. The actual history is different and more complicated, and in some ways both more and less damning than the myth. Pink Diamond went to the prime kindergarten in her rose quartz disguise and interacted with the emerging gems, and felt, maybe for the first time, what it meant to simply be among people without all the weight of diamondhood pressing down on the exchange. She and Pearl then went further, explored the planet's wild areas, looked at its organic life, forests and creatures and rivers, and the particular quality of light that exists on a living world that exists nowhere on a dead one. Pink became genuinely enchanted by what she saw. She returned to the moon base and asked the other diamonds to let her stop, to preserve the Earth instead of colonizing it, to acknowledge that what was already there had value. They said no. She asked again. They said no again. Yellow and blue, in flashbacks filtered through Pearl's memories, are dismissive in the specific way that authority tends to be dismissive of sentiment. This is what we do. This is how it works. The colony must continue. You knew what this planet was for when we gave it to you. Pink escalated her rose quartz persona into open rebellion. Her plan, initially, was simply to scare Homeworld's forces off the planet to be disruptive enough that the colonization project seemed too difficult to be worth continuing. She and Pearl began attacking Homeworld operations on Earth's surface, calling themselves the Crystal Gems. This is the very beginning of the Gem War. A diamond playing at being a rebel, still thinking, perhaps, that she could manage the situation and then fold it back up when she was done. But something happened that changed everything. And that something was Garnet. Ruby and Sapphire accidentally fused into a cross-gem fusion in the middle of a battle that was supposed to play out as Sapphire had foreseen it. Pink as Rose watched this happen. She watched Blue Diamond sentence Ruby to shattering for the transgression of fusing with a gem of a different type. She watched Sapphire grab Ruby and run. And she watched the two of them, once they were safe, choose to fuse again intentionally, choosing each other over all of Homeworld's rules about what was and wasn't appropriate. Pink saw that and felt something shift. Because up until that moment, her rebellion had been about the organic life of Earth, which she had come to love and wanted to protect. But watching Garnet exist, watching this impossible fusion made of two gems who shouldn't have worked together according to every rule the civilization had given them, but who worked together anyway, out of something that looked a lot like love. Pink understood that the Earth wasn't just worth fighting for because of the humans and the lions and the plants. It was worth fighting for because it was already demonstrating that the rules Homeworld lived by weren't the only way things could be. She expanded her cause. The crystal gems wouldn't just protect Earth's organic life. They'd protect any gem who wanted to exist outside the system. Any gem who had been told they were defective or wrong or too small or too different. The rebellion became something bigger than a land dispute. Pink Diamond, the actual youngest diamond, had started a revolution in someone else's name. The question of whether Pink fully understood what she was unleashing is one the show circles without quite landing on. She was, by all accounts, someone who acted before she thought through the consequences, not cruelly, but impulsively, with the specific flavor of someone who had been told her entire existence that her feelings and desires weren't important enough to take seriously, and who had therefore developed a habit of acting on them before anyone could stop her. She genuinely loved the Earth. She genuinely cared about the gems she recruited. And she also made decisions that caused enormous, lasting harm to specific people who trusted her, most notably Pearl, who is where this story becomes most uncomfortable. Pink, as part of the plan to fake her own shattering and end the war, issued Pearl a direct order as Pink's Diamond. Pearl was to help stage the assassination, shape-shifting into Rose's form and appearing to poof Pink Diamond in front of Homeworld witnesses, who would then see the fake gem shards Pink had swallowed tumble to the ground and believe their diamond had been destroyed. And Pearl was never to tell anyone what had happened. Not ever. Not to anyone. No matter what. That order, issued in the context of a diamond speaking to her Pearl, wasn't just a request. It was a compulsion. Pearl, who was literally built with deep loyalty to her, diamond wired into her sense of self, found herself physically unable to speak the truth when it mattered. The compulsion wasn't absolute. She could work around it, hint at it, eventually show Stephen her memories in a roundabout way, but it was real and it was ongoing and it lasted thousands of years. While Pearl was carrying the silence, Garnet didn't know. Amethyst didn't know. Stephen didn't know. And every time the subject of pink diamonds shattering came up, every time someone asked Pearl about Rose's past, Pearl had to navigate around the truth while the compulsion worked against her, visible on her face as a kind of physical flinching. Pink, when she became Rose permanently after the war ended, was free. She lived thousands of years on Earth, finally herself in the shape she'd chosen, finally among the people she'd chosen to be among. The war was over. Homeworld was gone. The Crystal Gems were a small group managing the aftermath of a civilization they'd pushed back. And Pearl spent those thousands of years carrying the secret, alone with what she knew, unable to put it down. The VHS tape Rose made for Stephen before she gave up her form to bring him into the world says, "I already love you." It says she has given up being a person so he could be his own. It says she is sorry, without specifying what for. It doesn't mention Pearl's compelled silence. It doesn't mention Bismuth, sealed away for millennia. It doesn't mention Spinel, left in a garden for 6,000 years. It doesn't mention the bubbled crystal gems stored in the temple's basement. She says sorry without a list, and then the tape ends and she's gone. What Pink Diamond left behind when she became Rose, and what Rose left behind when she became Stephen, is the question the entire show exists to turn over in its hands. Part 3. Pearl. 1,000 Years of Devotion and Silence. Pearl was created at a facility called the Reef, where pearls are made for higher-ranking gems. She was Pink Diamond's second pearl, the first having been taken away by White Diamond after Pink threw a tantrum that damaged Pink Pearl's eye. Pink was given this new pearl partly as a replacement and partly, the show implies, as an attempt to give her someone who could help her manage herself. A more formal pearl, less easy to lead astray, more capable of providing the structure and instruction that Pink seemed to lack. It didn't quite work out that way. Pearl arrived with a very specific set of programming, for lack of a better word, a deep, fundamental orientation toward her diamond's well-being and happiness. Pearls are created to serve. That's not a minor feature of their design, but the foundational architecture of who they are. Every pearl in the show is defined by relationship to someone else. Blue pearl serves blue diamond, yellow pearl serves yellow diamond, crystal gem pearl served pink diamond. This is the system. This is what pearls are for. What the system didn't account for was what happened when the diamond a pearl served encouraged her to be more than a servant. Pink, who had always been bored and frustrated by formality, didn't want Pearl to be a proper Pearl. She wanted Pearl to be her friend. She treated Pearl with equality and warmth, shared secrets with her that she didn't share with anyone else, valued Pearl's opinions and ideas. Pink's suggestion that Pearl could disguise herself as a quartz to sneak Pearl into the kindergarten, that was Pearl's idea. Pink took it and ran with it, but the seed was Pearl's. That matters because it means Pearl, from very early on in their relationship, was being treated as a person whose ideas had value and not just a fixture to be managed. This was, in the most affectionate and well-intentioned possible way, also the thing that broke Pearl in ways that took thousands of years to begin healing. Because Pearl didn't just develop devotion to Pink Diamond. She developed something much more complicated, a kind of love that went beyond the service programming she'd been born with and became deeply, personally romantic. Pearl loved Rose in the way you love someone who made you feel for the first time like your existence mattered, and that love didn't have anywhere to go except further inward. Because Rose eventually developed her own romantic relationship with a human named Greg Universe, and Pearl had to watch that happen from close range while being unable to either leave or fully move through her feelings about it. It's over, isn't it? Sung by Pearl in the episode Mr. Greg is the show's most direct articulation of this. It's a song about Pearl standing on a rooftop, watching Greg and Stephen in the building below, and processing in real time the reality that Rose had chosen Greg. Not in a way that excludes Pearl from Rose's affection, but in a way that clarifies that what Greg and Rose had was something Pearl and Rose didn't have. The song is 3 minutes long. It says more about Pearl's interior life than any amount of dialogue would have managed. It says that she gave everything to someone who is now gone, and that the person who carries that someone forward is the son of the person who took Rose from her, and that she doesn't know what to do with any of that. The compelled silence around Pink Diamond's secret sits on top of all of this grief like a second weight. Pearl couldn't talk about what Rose actually was. She couldn't tell Steven why she kept flinching every time his mother came up. She couldn't explain to Garnet or Amethyst why there were things about Rose's past she simply couldn't address. The cover pose Pearl covering her own mouth appears multiple times in the show before it's explained, a visual tell that the show's most attentive viewers noticed years before the Season 5 reveal. When Pearl learned to sword fight, she learned it at the ancient sky arena on Earth during the Rebellion, absorbing the concept of knighthood from human cultural contact, the idea of being completely dedicated to a person and a cause. She took that concept and built her entire self around it. Rose made Pearl feel like she was everything, which is a beautiful thing to feel, and which also meant that Pearl's sense of self-worth was almost entirely located in her relationship to Rose. Without Rose, Pearl was unmoored in a way the show doesn't minimize. The first seasons of Steven Universe are partly about Pearl in ongoing, grief-stricken freefall, doing her best to be what Steven needs while carrying the weight of what she's lost. The Sardonyx arc in Season 2, which involves Pearl secretly rebuilding a homeworld communications tower just so she can fuse with Garnet to feel close to her, a coping mechanism born from loneliness and a need for connection that she's never learned healthy ways to address, is the show being honest about what happens when someone's ability to form relationships has been shaped by centuries of devotion to a single person. Pearl doesn't know how to need people in moderation. She knows how to give everything to one person and structure her entire existence around them. That's what she was made for, and that's what she practiced for thousands of years. Learning any other way is the work of the whole show for her. The episode Last One Out of Beach City, a Season 3 episode where Pearl, Amethyst, and Steven go to a concert, and Pearl encounters a young woman with short pink hair who vaguely reminds her of Rose, is remarkable for what it does quietly. Pearl gets the woman's number. She gets herself a mobile phone specifically to be able to call it, and then the show never tells us what she does with that number. It's a thread the series set up and never got to follow. Whether Pearl called, whether she got voicemail and hung up, whether she texted something and then deleted it, whether she's still sitting on that number somewhere in the timeline of Steven Universe future, none of this is addressed. It's one of the more quietly heartbreaking gaps in the series. Pearl, having spent thousands of years devoted to a specific person, takes one tentative step toward the possibility of something new. And then the show, running out of time, leaves her there. What Pearl becomes across the series is not healed. Exactly healing is rarely the right word for the kind of change she undergoes. She becomes more herself, more capable of defining her own desires and values outside of who she's serving, more capable of admitting that she had romantic feelings for Rose, and that those feelings were complicated, and that those complications were real. In Steven Universe Future, Pearl teaches at Little Home School, helping newly arrived gems understand how to interact with humans and make choices about their own lives. She is, in that context, teaching other gems how to do the things she learned to do herself, exist independently of who they were made for. That's what growth looks like for someone like Pearl. Not a sudden transformation, but the slow, deliberate construction of a self that doesn't need someone else's existence to justify its own. Part 4. Garnet Love as a Revolutionary Act. Ruby and Sapphire's first meeting lasted approximately 11 minutes of screen time across the second season episode called The Answer. It earned a nomination for a Primetime Emmy Award, was adapted into a best-selling children's book, and is frequently cited as one of the show's finest pieces of storytelling. All of that is true, and none of it quite captures what it actually feels like to watch it. The setup: 5,750 years ago, the Gem War is in its early stages. Homeworld sends a diplomatic team to Earth to assess the situation among them. Sapphire, an aristocratic gem with future vision, assigned to report to Blue Diamond on the likely outcome of the next engagement. 3 Ruby guards accompany her. Their function is protection. Their design is pragmatic. Rubies deployed individually are common soldiers, but rubies can fuse with other rubies to become more powerful, and so they tend to be sent in groups. Sapphire reports her vision to Blue Diamond. The crystal gems will attack. 7 gems will be poofed, including 2 rubies and Sapphire herself, but then the rebels will be captured, and the rebellion will effectively end. It is a specific and apparently reliable prediction. Everyone proceeds on the assumption that it will happen exactly as foreseen. It doesn't. Pearl cuts through the Cloud Arena with dual swords. The three rubies attempt to fuse together into a Mega Ruby to counter her. Rose destroys the Mega Ruby, poofing two of its components exactly as Sapphire saw. Pearl advances on Sapphire. One of the rubies, seeing what's about to happen, throws herself in the way. Not because she calculated the odds. Not because her mission required it. Because she looked at Sapphire and didn't want her to be hurt. Ruby threw herself in front of Pearl's attack out of something that looked like feeling, and the momentum of that throw, that impulsive act of protection, carried Ruby and Sapphire into contact, and the contact became fusion, cross-gem fusion, a ruby and a sapphire, both of them small enough individually. Together, they make Garnet this wide-shouldered, three-eyed, bewilderingly new being in mismatched cotton candy colors, and every homeworld gem in the Cloud Arena stops. Because they have never seen this before. Because this isn't supposed to be possible. Because the rules of Homeworld say that fusion between different gem types is an aberration, a grotesque departure from how things are supposed to be. Blue Diamond sentences Ruby to shattering for the transgression. Sapphire grabs Ruby and runs. They fall off the Cloud Arena and land on Earth's surface, and the rebellion continues without the convenient ending that Sapphire's vision had promised. On the ground, Ruby and Sapphire have to figure out who they are and what happened. Ruby blames herself for the mission's failure. Sapphire has had her future vision disrupted by Ruby's impulsive action. She saw one future, and Ruby changed it entirely, which is a kind of miracle that Sapphire doesn't yet have words for. They talk, they explore. They awkwardly, tentatively get to know each other in the most genuine possible sense. Two beings who shared a body by accident and are now trying to understand what that meant. They sing Something Entirely New, one of the show's most simply beautiful songs. A quiet duet about discovering that what you are together is different from what you were separately, and that the difference is not bad. They choose to fuse again, intentionally, together. And they find Pearl and Rose tells the new Garnet something that becomes the show's central thesis, delivered to a three-eyed being who is still getting used to having legs. You are already the answer to all your questions. Love. The answer is love. Stephen, when Garnet finishes telling him this story, says he knew it all along. Garnet tells him that so did she. That origin story has layers that the show continues to build on across the entire series. Garnet's existence is itself a political statement, a protest, made permanent, against Homeworld's classification of certain kinds of love as inappropriate or defective. She is, as the show eventually says explicitly, a being made of love, the literal embodiment of the relationship between Ruby and Sapphire, and she has been walking around in that form for 5,750 years. The show spends time on what this means for Ruby and Sapphire individually, because they are real people outside of Garnet even if they choose to almost always exist within her. The episode Keystone Motel shows Ruby and Sapphire unfused and fighting in a motel room, unable to be Garnet because Garnet requires a level of consensus between them that they don't have in that moment, and the fight is recognizable as the kind of argument that any couple has about principle and compromise and who gets to decide what the relationship stands for. The episode Now We're Only Falling Apart in Season 5 shows the moment Sapphire learns the full truth about Rose being Pink Diamond and what it means to her. She was told to embrace her existence as a fusion by someone who turned out to have been lying about her own identity. The ground shifts under her. She and Ruby separate, and Ruby goes to find out who she is outside of Garnet, and that journey is given genuine screen time because the show understands that it matters. What Garnet represents in the larger lore is more than a character arc, though. She represents the argument that the crystal gems are making with their existence. Homeworld says certain things can't be. Garnet exists and says, "Watch me." Every time Garnet has walked into a room across 5,750 years, she has been walking evidence that the system's rules about what is and isn't possible are wrong. The fact that she is also a steady, caring, powerful leader who has kept the crystal gems functioning across thousands of years of post-war Earth existence is inseparable from that. Garnet's stability comes from the security of her own identity. She doesn't question herself the way Pearl does. She doesn't spiral into self-deprecation the way Amethyst sometimes does. She is grounded because she knows what she is, a relationship that chose itself. And the show is careful to show that this groundedness doesn't mean she doesn't struggle. She struggles plenty, across different arcs, and in her relationships with Ruby and Sapphire. but that there is something fundamentally different between struggling while knowing who you are and struggling without that anchor. The fusion mechanic in the show is one of its richest and most thoroughly developed ideas. Two or more gems combining into a single being whose stability depends entirely on the quality of the relationship between them. This is the show making its thesis about relationships literal. Healthy fusions, formed from genuine connection and mutual respect, are stable and powerful. Unhealthy fusions, formed from coercion or deceit or one partner's willingness to suppress themselves for the other, are unstable, chaotic, sometimes monstrous. Malachite, the fusion of lapis lazuli and jasper, is the show's most striking illustration of what happens when two beings fuse not out of love or even genuine cooperation, but out of desperate need and mutual harm. But garnet, as a fusion formed in an accident that neither ruby nor sapphire planned for, represents something specific, the discovery of something good that neither person knew they were looking for. That's the story of Garnet. And it's the story the show tells across 5 seasons about what it means to know yourself well enough to choose who you want to be. Part 5. Lapis Lazuli, the innocent casualty of ancient wars. Lapis Lazuli was not a rebel. This is the important thing to understand about her, and it's the thing the show makes clear in the episode Same Old World, which fills in her backstory. She was not a crystal gem, she was not a homeworld soldier. She was a lapis lazuli, a terraformer, a gem made to reshape the surfaces of planets under Homeworld's direction, who visited Earth briefly during the era of its colonization for reasons that had nothing to do with the war. She got caught in the middle. She was hit by Bismuth when Bismuth attacked what she thought was a Homeworld gem. Homeworld soldiers, recovering her poofed gemstone, assumed she was one of the crystal gems. They imprisoned her in a magical mirror, intending to interrogate her for information about the rebels. She didn't have that information. She wasn't a rebel. She knew nothing of use to either side. She was a gem who had been in the wrong place at a bad time, and now she was in a mirror, and the soldiers who had put her there left to fight the war, and the war eventually ended with the corrupting light, and everyone who had imprisoned her had fled the planet, and the mirror was left behind, and Lapis stayed in it for somewhere around 5,000 years. She was aware in there, after a fashion. The mirror could show anyone who looked into it any event it had ever witnessed. It was a recording device of sorts, and Lapis was inside that recording device, trapped, unable to communicate except through the mirror's existing footage, replaying images and sounds from a time she'd been present for but never part of. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak in her own voice. She couldn't do anything except be there. For millennia, while the war she'd had nothing to do with resolved itself, and the world above her moved on, and her cracked gemstone sat fixed on the back of a mirror that had been left at the galaxy warp. Pearl eventually found the mirror and brought it back. She gave it to Steven to use as an educational tool to learn about gem history, and Lapis, who had spent 5,000 years unable to communicate in her own voice, figured out how to talk to Steven through the mirror's recordings, how to answer him, how to reach him, how to make him understand that there was someone in there. And Steven, who was 11 years old and had spent his entire life being told by the crystal gems to trust them, decided to trust the mirror instead and freed her. Lapis's first words, fully formed in her own, "I'm Lapis Lazuli, and you can't keep me trapped here anymore." Then she left. She went back toward Homeworld, drawing a massive column of the Atlantic Ocean with her as she flew, using her extraordinary hydrokinetic abilities to push herself upward and away from a planet she had every reason to hate. The crystal gems tried to stop her, and she who had been in a mirror for 5,000 years, and whose gemstone was cracked, and who should by any rights have been severely diminished in power, fought them all at once using water duplicates and nearly won. That's the lore detail that matters most about Lapis, and it's one the show makes explicit much later. She is unusually powerful, even by Lapis Lazuli standards. Other Lapis Lazulis appear briefly in Steven Universe Future, and it becomes clear that Lapis is significantly stronger than most of her type, enough that when she turns her full power on them, they are immediately cowed. What the show leaves mysterious is why. Was she always this strong? Did 5,000 years in a mirror do something to her, concentrate her power somehow? Did the trauma itself change what she was capable of? No answer is given. She's just powerful, in excess of what she should be. The next time we see Lapis is when she arrives back at Earth with Jasper and Peridot, now an involuntary informant for Homeworld. After her return there resulted not in freedom but in a new kind of captivity. Jasper, the Homeworld elite soldier assigned to assess the Earth situation, coerces Lapis into fusing with her. Lapis agrees and then immediately turns the resulting fusion against Jasper, dragging both of them to the bottom of the ocean to keep Jasper from hurting Steven. This is Malachite. This is the fusion that looks like nothing else in the show enormous, four-armed, wild-eyed, a being made of two incompatible beings pulling in opposite directions. Lapis held them both at the bottom of the ocean for an entire season while Steven and the crystal gems were doing other things. She held them there by sheer will, containing Jasper's rage and her own desperate need for control in the only way available to her, by making a prison of herself. The episode Alone at Sea, which revisits Lapis and Jasper's dynamic after Malachite is eventually broken apart, is the most quietly brave thing the show does with either of them. Because Jasper comes back in that episode, having been corrupted and partially restored, and she doesn't come back with threats. She comes back asking Lapis to fuse with her again. And Lapis, in the moment of that conversation, admits something the show had been carefully constructing toward. She missed her. She had drawn satisfaction from being the one with control. She had needed the dynamic. She had liked being the one doing the imprisoning for once, after all the time she'd been imprisoned. And what she's describing is something that looks like the specific psychology of an abuse survivor who found themselves on the other side of the power imbalance and discovered something complicated and uncomfortable about how that felt. The show doesn't make this moment easy. It doesn't resolve it with a quick explanation or a tidy moral. It sits with the messiness of it. Because Lapis's experience of being imprisoned, repeatedly, by forces that didn't care about her, of being used as a tool by Homeworld and then by Jasper, and then in some sense, by the crystal gems, who kept the mirror for years without knowing she was in it, is the experience of someone whose agency has been repeatedly stripped away, and the ways she responds to that don't always look like the responses we'd want her to have. Eventually, Lapis goes to the barn with Peridot. They make art together. They watch a soap opera called Camp Pining Hearts. They become friends in a slow, tentative way that the show renders with real affection. When Homeworld's ships appear in the sky over Earth in the 4th season finale, Lapis panics and flies away with the barn, taking it to the moon and then into space, and then returning it to the moon when she realizes she's still alone, even in the void. She can't go back because she doesn't know if going back will result in another kind of captivity. She can't stay away because the people she cares about are down there. Her arc never fully resolves in the way the main Crystal Gems' arcs do, and that might be appropriate. Because Lapis was always the show's representation of something specific, the civilian caught in someone else's war. The person who wasn't a soldier, wasn't a rebel, wasn't fighting for any cause, just existed in the wrong place at the wrong time and paid for it across 5,000 years of imprisonment. Her damage is proportional to that. Her recovery is proportional to it, too slow and real and ongoing. Not a transformation, but a process. The Rebecca Sugar note about Lapis's gem placement on her back, suggesting vulnerability, an inability to see herself, being exposed to forces she can't control, is one of those small lore details that illuminate everything. The gem is part of the character. What your gem is and where it is tells you something about who you are in this world. Lapis Lazuli, gem on her back, can't see her own power until someone turns her around to look. Part 6. The corrupting light, what 3 diamonds did when they had nothing left to lose. Here is the sequence of events as the show gives them to us. Assembled across multiple episodes and seasons and flashbacks, Pink Diamond appears to be shattered. The Crystal Gems, led by Rose, win the Gem War, at least in the sense that Homeworld's forces evacuate Earth. Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond and White Diamond believe that Pink, the youngest member of their authority, has been destroyed by a common Quartz soldier. They are in grief. They are in rage. They are in the specific state of powerful beings who have just suffered a loss that their power couldn't prevent, and who have no good outlet for what that state demands of them. And so they point themselves at the planet that cost them Pink Diamond, and they do what 3 beings of their power, in that emotional state, can do. They scream, essentially. They release something, a burst of combined diamond power that the show calls the corrupting light that sweeps across the earth and hits every gem remaining on its surface. The effect is not death. It is something the show argues is more complicated than death. Gems caught by the corrupting light have their minds and forms transformed. Their sentience, their identity, their memories, these are stripped away or fundamentally distorted. What's left is something driven by instinct and fear, something that has lost the capacity to recognize the people it once knew or the world it once lived in. The corrupted gems maintain enormous physical power. Many of them become large, dangerous creatures that the crystal gems spend much of the show's first seasons tracking and bubbling, but they are not, in any meaningful sense, the people they were. Rose's shield protected Pearl and Garnet in the moment of the corrupting light's release. Amethyst was still underground, still gestating, and emerged into a world where the corruption had already happened. She was never exposed to it. Bismuth was bubbled inside Lion's dimension. Lapis Lazuli had her gemstone cracked and was trapped in the mirror at the galaxy warp. And whether the mirror's glass spared her from the light or whether the crack itself changed things is never specified. Rose herself, as a diamond in disguise, would have been inherently resistant to a diamond weapon. But every other crystal gem on Earth at the time of the corrupting light, every quartz soldier who had joined the rebellion because she wanted to be more than what Homeworld made her, every gem who had fought for Earth, every member of this growing movement that Pink Diamond had started and then handed off was caught in it. Centipedal is the one the show comes back to most carefully. She is a nephrite, a gem whose gemstone configuration suggests she was a pilot or navigator of some kind, who fought with the crystal gems during the rebellion. In the episode Monster Reunion, Steven manages a partial restoration of her through his healing powers. Not enough to fully restore her form or her voice, but enough to restore fragments of her memory. She draws, desperately and frantically, because drawing is the only communication she can manage. She draws a ship. She draws the crystal gem symbol. She draws the corrupting light coming from the sky. She draws Rose with her arms outstretched. That last image, Rose, arms out, in a gesture that reads as either embrace or shield or apology, is the one that sits with you. Centipedal remembered Rose. She recognized what Rose had tried to do in the moment the light came. She drew her with a specificity that suggests a relationship, a real one. Not just soldier and general, but two beings who knew each other in a way that mattered. What that relationship was, who Centipedal was to Rose among all the crystal gems she led, the show never says. The arithmetic of the corrupting light is one of the things Steven Universe doesn't add up to a clean moral. Rose survived, and Garnet and Pearl survived because of her shield. Thousands of others didn't. Was there anything she could have done differently? Could she have shielded more of them if she'd known what was coming, or if she'd had more time? The show raises this by not answering it, by letting the question exist in the space where the answer should be. The cluster is the corrupting light's darkest consequence. When Homeworld eventually sent missions back to Earth to assess what had happened and take advantage of whatever was recoverable, they found the corrupted gems. They also found gem shards, fragments of gems that had been broken during the war or in the corruption's aftermath, each one still alive in a minimal, distressed way. Homeworld scientists, and this is the detail that makes it genuinely horrible, took millions of these shards and forcibly fused them together into a single, massive entity buried in the Earth's core, designed to eventually emerge and destroy the planet. The cluster is, in the show's moral logic, the worst thing Homeworld ever did. Not the corruption, which was an act of grief and rage, awful but at least legible as a catastrophic emotional response. The cluster is deliberate. Someone looked at millions of fragments of beings, each one still aware enough to suffer, and chose to use them as raw material for a weapon. The specific character of that suffering is something Steven manages to perceive when he communicates with the cluster in the Season 3 episode Gem Drill, all those fragments pulling in different directions, all those partial consciousnesses unable to cohere into anything stable, the constant agony of it. Steven helps the cluster find a kind of internal equilibrium by teaching it to bubble itself. It works. The weapon neutralizes itself. But what happens to the cluster after the series ends? The healing light that restores the corrupted gems in the show's finale is shown in sweeping, beautiful terms. All the corrupted gems on Earth, healed at once, the centuries of their imprisonment simply ended. The show presents this as total, as though the light reaches every corrupted gem everywhere. But the cluster is millions of fused shards, not individual corrupted gems. Whether it could be restored, whether the shards inside it could become individual beings again, whether those beings could be given back what they had before is never addressed. It is still down there, bubbled in the Earth's core, presumably stable and at peace. Some things the show can gesture toward without fully resolving. The cluster is one of them. The show knows that a complete accounting of the corruption's toll would be impossible, and it doesn't pretend otherwise. What it does instead is make you feel the weight of it through individual cases. Centipedal's drawings, the cluster's distress, the corrupted gems in the Crystal Temple's bubbling room that Stephen has looked at his entire life without knowing who they were or who they'd been. The finale's mass healing is earned and real, and it doesn't mean every consequence has been addressed. Some consequences extend further than the story does. The cure always required all 4 diamond powers working together. The show reveals this in the finale as Stephen stands in for Pink Diamond and combines with white, yellow, and blue to produce the healing light, which means the corruption from the moment it happened was always theoretically reversible. The 4 powers that caused it were, in some sense, always the 4 powers that could undo it. The 5,000 years between the corruption and the healing weren't about technical impossibility. They were about the diamonds not knowing what they'd done, and then knowing but not being willing to admit it, and then admitting it but not having someone to make them follow through. What the show does with that is argue, quietly but persistently, that the acknowledgement of harm and the willingness to repair it are not the same thing as the repair itself. White Diamond could have, at some point in the last 5,000 years, noticed that Earth was full of corrupted gems and done something about it. She didn't. Because noticing would have required admitting imperfection, and admitting imperfection was something White Diamond's entire architecture of self was built to prevent. Stephen is what changes that. Not through power, exactly, but through persistent, loving, genuinely felt refusal to believe that any being is too far gone to acknowledge truth. That's the theme the show returns to over and over across its full run. Not that love conquers all in the fairy tale sense, but that the willingness to actually look at someone, to see them clearly, and to insist on their capacity for something better, that's the force that moves things. Part 7. The weapons in the Crystal Temple Bismuth, and the question she kept asking. We need to talk about Bismuth. Bismuth is one of the crystal gems, one of the original members of the rebellion, a gem whose function is construction and metalwork. She's enormously strong, brilliant with her hands, warm and funny in the way of someone who builds things and takes genuine pleasure in making them work. She was one of Rose's closest early allies. She built the forge where the crystal gems' weapons were crafted. She made Rose's sword, specifically made it to Rose's specification, a sword that could disrupt a gem's physical form without damaging the gem itself. The choice not to create a shattering weapon was Rose's deliberate choice, made on moral principle. Bismuth's episode, the 100th episode of the series, a double-length special that brought in Uzo Aduba to voice her, is one of the finest pieces of television the show produced. It's also the episode that asks the hardest question and does the least to provide a comfortable answer. Bismuth built something she called the breaking point, a weapon designed to shatter any gem in a single strike, including a diamond. Her argument for it: the crystal gems were fighting a war against opponents who would shatter them without hesitation. The asymmetry was real. You could poof a homeworld gem, send them back to their gemstone to reform, but they would always return. You couldn't end the threat permanently without being willing to end it permanently. The diamonds in particular were effectively impossible to poof through conventional means. They were too powerful, too durable. The breaking point would change that. It would make the war winnable in a way it otherwise wasn't. Rose said no. Rose said it wasn't right to shatter any gem, regardless of what they'd done. Gems were not to be destroyed. That was the principle the rebellion stood on, the thing that made them different from Homeworld. Bismuth pushed back. They fought. Rose poofed her, sealed her in a bubble, placed the bubble inside Lion's dimension, and told the other crystal gems that Bismuth had gone missing in battle. She left her in there for the length of the war, the 5,000 years of post-war Earth, and the start of Stephen's story. When Bismuth eventually meets Stephen when she comes out of the bubble and realizes this boy is not Rose, but carries Rose's gem, she processes it with a careful sadness. She upgrades the crystal gems as weapons. She talks about the rebellion with genuine passion. She and Amethyst and Pearl have a warm, rough reunion of the kind old comrades have. And then she shows Steven the breaking point, and her arguments are exactly what they were when she made them, and they're still not wrong. Here's what the show can't quite get around, and to its credit, doesn't try to avoid. Rose's non-lethal philosophy had costs. Real ones, paid by real people. The crystal gems who were corrupted in the war's final moments might have lived differently if the war had ended faster, and the war might have ended faster if the Diamond Authority had faced the kind of permanent threat that the breaking point would have represented. Bismuth's position was militarily reasonable. Her argument was ethically serious. She was asking a real question about what it costs to fight a just war without certain weapons, and that question deserved a real answer. What she got instead was 5,000 years in a bubble. The show doesn't vindicate Bismuth's position. It doesn't say she was right that the breaking point should have been used, but it also doesn't really refute her. It moves past the argument, largely through the emotional logic of the finale, the revelation that communication and recognition of each other's personhood can dismantle systems of power in ways that violence can't, without directly addressing the historical question of what Bismuth's suggestion would have cost or prevented if it had been used. There is also this. Rose drew the line at shattering gems. She did not draw the same line at causing ongoing psychological harm to Pearl through a compelled silence that lasted thousands of years. She sealed Bismuth away rather than continue an argument she didn't want to have. The ethical consistency of Rose's stated principles and her actual behavior is something the show acknowledges without fully resolving, because the person who could resolve it is gone. Bismuth, at the end of the show, is there with the crystal gems. She and Pearl hug. She's helping rebuild and forge new things in Era 3. She makes a dark joke when she learns Rose was Pink Diamond, something about how she almost gave Rose the idea to fake her own death, which means the weapon she built to kill the Crystal Gems leader nearly helped that leader fake her own assassination. There's a quality of exhausted, sardonic humor in it that is exactly right for the character. She's there. She's part of the world now. And the question she was asking about what you owe the people you're fighting for, about whether principle is a luxury when the people with power don't share it, about whether mercy is always wise or sometimes just comfortable, that question is still there too. It didn't get answered. It got set aside in favor of the ending the show needed to tell. And setting it aside while acknowledging it was set aside is probably the most honest thing the show could have done with it. Part 8. Steven Universe Future. When saving the world doesn't save yourself. The epilogue series Steven Universe Future begins 2 years after the events of the main series finale, after Steven has healed the corrupted gems and helped dismantle the Diamond Authority's empire and set in motion what is being called Era 3 of Gem Civilization. He is living in Beach City. He has a new house. Little homeschool is operating, helping gems new to Earth learn how to exist here. The crystal gems are fine, essentially. Everyone is fine. Steven is fine. He is not fine. What Future spends its 20 episodes doing is something that was genuinely unusual for an animated series aimed at younger audiences. It shows the hero in the aftermath, after the last boss has been defeated, and argues that what the hero did over the course of years of saving the world has not been free of cost. The cost accrued quietly, over time, while Steven was too busy saving everyone to pay attention to it. And now the crisis is over, and the cost is still there, and there's nothing left to fight, so the only thing left to fight is what's inside him. The pink state is what Future calls it, though it doesn't give it that name explicitly. When Steven is under emotional stress, genuine, overwhelming, unprocessed emotional stress, his gem glows pink, his skin flushes, and he becomes something physically different, larger, warmer. His powers become destabilizing in ways he can't direct. He can crack the gemstones of other gems just by touching them. He generates heat and energy that he has no way to control or stop. The first time it happens, it's startling. As the series progresses and it happens more frequently, it becomes clear that this isn't simply a new power manifesting. It's his body responding to stress as though his life is in danger, because for most of his childhood, his life genuinely was in danger, and the physiological memory of that doesn't simply stop when the actual danger ends. Connie is the one who first notices and says it aloud, though others notice too. She recommends that Steven see a doctor, He goes to see Dr. Maheswaran Kani's mother, who has known about the gem world long enough to have some context for what she's looking at. In the episode Growing Pains, Dr. Maheshwaran explains to Stephen what she's observing in terms of adverse childhood experiences ACEs, a real medical concept that describes how traumatic events in childhood create lasting physiological responses that affect how a person's body reacts to stress long after the original trauma has passed. Stephen's body has been trained by years of genuine life-threatening situations to treat any significant emotional stress as a signal that he is about to die, so his powers activate. So he becomes something that can defend itself from threats. Even when the threat is a conversation about feelings, or a friend going away to college, or the question of what he's supposed to do now that he doesn't have a world to save. The show is careful and specific about this in a way that children's television rarely is, and the care is worth noting. It doesn't use PTSD as a label, it doesn't need to, but it describes the mechanism accurately and with genuine empathy for what it means to experience it. Stephen has done extraordinary things. He has genuinely saved the world and helped people he loved and made a lasting positive difference. None of that is negated by the fact that doing all of it took a toll he didn't know he was paying. There is also a strand of Steven Universe future that deals with identity in a way that cuts even deeper. White Diamond, when she first meets Steven, insists that he is Pink Diamond. Not Steven, not Rose's son, not his own person, he is Pink, she tells him. And all of this Stevenness is just Pink suppressing herself the way she always did. The show validates Steven's insistence that this is wrong, that he is genuinely himself, that his identity is real and not a mask over something underneath. But Future complicates the clean separation by showing that when Steven's emotional regulation breaks down, what emerges looks specifically like Pink Diamond's power. The diamond strength that corrupted an entire planet. The same cosmic force that white, yellow, and blue used to heal the corruption when channeled through Steven. What is Steven exactly? The show doesn't give a physiological or metaphysical answer. It gives a human one. He is loved, and the people who love him tell him so, and he learns to let that in, and he starts to work on himself with a therapist, and he leaves Beach City in a van with Connie to go figure out what his life looks like when it's actually his. That's the ending the show gives him, and it's the right one. The question of what he is, gem or human or something neither civilization has a word for, isn't answered because the answer isn't the point. The point is that he gets to keep going. But there are things Future doesn't quite settle. What happened to the rose quartzes who were bubbled for thousands of years because they shared a form with the gem who supposedly shattered Pink Diamond? In the episode Rose Buds, 3 rose quartzes come to stay with Steven, and their presence is deeply uncomfortable for everyone. For the crystal gems who spent millennia believing they'd lost their leader, for Greg who sees the face of the woman he loved, for Steven who has never met his mother but now has 3 versions of her form sitting in his kitchen eating cereal. The rose quartzes' inner lives, their experience of 5,000 years of imprisonment for something none of them did, is touched on briefly and then the episode moves past it. It's another of those threads the show acknowledged without completing. The question of what Steven does next, whether he ages normally, whether the gem eventually slows his aging as it did for Lion and Lars, whether Rose's consciousness is somehow present in him, or whether she truly dissolved entirely is left entirely open. Rebecca Sugar, in interviews around the time of Future's airing, spoke about the importance of the ending being a beginning, of leaving Steven's future genuinely unwritten, rather than foreclosing it with explanation. That feels right as a creative choice. And it also means that one of the show's central mysteries, what Steven actually is, in physiological and metaphysical terms, remains officially undefined. He's himself. He keeps going. The gem is in his stomach and he drives away, and the road opens up ahead of him. That's what the show gives you. The future is unwritten, and in Steven Universe, that's not a failure. It's the point. Part 9. The music between the words, how sound carries the lore. Steven Universe is built like a musical, in the technical sense. The songs aren't interludes or decorations, but load-bearing structural elements that carry information the dialogue can't reach. Rebecca Sugar wrote songs for the series during her travels, accumulated them over the years of the show's run, and used them as the primary vehicle for emotional truth in a way that distinguished the show from nearly everything else in children's animation. The leitmotifs begin with the characters themselves. Ivy Tran and Steven Sarashu Velema, the chiptune and piano duo who composed the show's instrumental score after being recommended by a crew member who knew Avi's previous work, developed a system in which each major character has a signature instrument and a recurring, melodic theme that evolves across the show's run. Pearl's theme is a piano specifically, a kind of mournful, elegant piano that draws from romantic classical tradition, with phrasing that suggests both grace and suppressed sadness. Garnet's is a synth bass, deep and rhythmic and stable, reflecting her groundedness. Amethyst's is a drum machine with electric bass and synths, chaotic and energetic. Stevens is chiptune, evoking video games and childhood and the specific quality of innocence maintained in the face of real danger. These aren't just mood music, they're information. When Pearl's theme plays in a scene that isn't about Pearl, you pay attention to why. When you hear Garnet's deep bass pulse during a moment of Stevens' doubt, it means something. The score is a second layer of dialogue running beneath the spoken one, and the composers understood this so thoroughly that they built the entire architecture of the music around it. The ending theme deserves its own extended discussion. Love Like You is technically the show's credits song, the piece that plays at the end of each episode. But it's more than that. It was built across the entire first 3 seasons as an ongoing accumulation, new verses added with each new variation of the credits, music, the song slowly completing itself as the show progressed. The song is written from the perspective of someone who loves another person and doesn't understand how anyone could love someone as imperfect and damaged as the singer feels themselves to be. The final complete version of the song, which was eventually performed publicly by Rebecca Sugar, is devastating in the way that only simple things said precisely can be. The credits variations were also used as foreshadowing. As Homeworld's ships began approaching Earth in the first season's latter half, the credits music started incorporating static brief, subtle, growing louder. If you were paying attention, you noticed. If you weren't, you heard something slightly off and didn't know why. By the time the Homeworld threat became visible in the narrative, the music had been warning about it for months. The show was literate in its own musical language, and rewarded viewers who were literate in return. The songs themselves are worth going through individually, because each one operates as a piece of characterization that works on its own, even divorced from the episode that contains it. Stronger Than You, Garnet's battle song from the first season finale Jailbreak, sung at the moment when the truth of her fusion is revealed, is the most immediately powerful. It's a defiant declaration of self, of the stability of love as a foundation, of the refusal to be destabilized by someone who doesn't understand what she's made of. It became a cultural phenomenon in certain online communities and remains one of the most recognizable songs from the series. Here Comes a Thought, sung by Garnet with Steven and Connie, is a meditation on anxiety and intrusive thoughts that manages to be simultaneously a therapeutic tool, a piece of music education, and a piece of Garnet's characterization that reveals something about Sapphire's struggle with future vision. The song describes how a thought starts small and grows and takes over, and how you can let it pass through you rather than fight it. It works as an explanation of mindfulness techniques for children. It also works as a portrait of what it means to have a mind that perceives time differently from everyone around you, which is the thing Sapphire has always had to manage within Garnet. It's Over, isn't it? Is 3 minutes and contains more of Pearl's interior life than any other single piece of the show. It's her at a window, watching Greg and Steven below, finally saying aloud the thing she hasn't been allowed to say, that she loved Rose, that Rose chose Greg, that she doesn't understand what it means to move forward from something that comprehensive. The animation in the scene strips away everything except Pearl, alone in the frame, which is exactly right. She is alone with this. She has been alone with it for a very long time. What's the use of feeling blue? Yellow Diamond's attempt to convince Blue Diamond to stop mourning Pink is the show doing something technically brilliant with character and contradiction. Yellow's entire argument is that grief is useless, that the way to deal with loss is to go back to work, that feeling things is an inefficiency, but the song itself is full of feeling. Yellow is grieving Pink too. She's just expressing it by telling Blue to stop, by working harder, by insisting on functionality as a substitute for processing. The irony is in the music itself, which is warm and emotionally loaded, even as the lyrics tell you that emotions are a waste of time. You understand Yellow Diamond's psychology in 3 minutes better than any number of dialogue scenes could have accomplished. Change your mind? The song at the center of the season 5 finale is the show's thesis stated as directly as it ever gets. The lyric is simple. You don't have to be what they made you to be. You can change. You can choose something different. It's addressed to White Diamond in the narrative, but it's addressed to everyone who has ever felt that the version of themselves the world wanted was the only version they were allowed to be. The song doesn't have the most complex musical structure in the show's catalog, but it doesn't need to. The power is in the sincerity, in the directness, in Steven standing in front of the most powerful being in the universe and insisting on the possibility of something better. And then there is something entirely new. The song from The Answer, the duet between Ruby and Sapphire in the aftermath of their first fusion. It is, structurally, a song about not knowing what to call an experience that has no precedent. They've both been parts of something that neither of them has words for, and the song is them feeling their way toward language. The callback to Stronger Than You, buried in it a brief melodic echo that connects Garnet's battle anthem to the moment of her creation, rewards listeners who know both songs, turning The Answer into a prequel to Jailbreak in musical terms. The instrumental score by Avi and Sarashu has a quality that's genuinely hard to describe without using the word soft, which feels like an understatement. It's gentle and slightly melancholy and occasionally startlingly beautiful, the kind of music that you don't consciously notice while you're watching but that you realize later has been in your head for days. The composers cited video game music as a primary influence, which explains the chiptune elements but also the way the music is functional. It does something. It moves the scene somewhere, rather than just existing atmospherically. They scored from character, always, building from the leitmotif system rather than from mood boards. What the music system ultimately creates is a show where you can watch an episode with your eyes closed and still understand something true about the characters, about the emotional state of the scene, about the relationship between what's being said and what's being felt. That's not an accident. That's the result of a composer duo who understood what they were being asked to do and took it seriously, and a showrunner who understood that music is not supplementary to storytelling, but fundamental to it. Steven Universe is a show about what we carry from the people who came before us. The music is what the characters carry between scenes, between seasons, between moments of loss and moments of recognition. It's the emotional residue of everything that happened, made audible, waiting to be heard. Part 10. What the Shore Holds: Beach City, the humans who lived beside magic, and the world that keeps going. Beach City is a real place in the way that the best fictional places are real not on any map, but textured and specific enough that you could navigate it. Rebecca and Steven Sugar traveled to their childhood Delaware beaches when the show was greenlit in 2012, specifically trying to capture not just how those places looked, but how they felt. Rehoboth Beach, Bethany Beach, Dewey Beach, faded summer towns with boardwalks and funland arcades and seafood restaurants, and the particular light of the American East Coast in late afternoon. The show's setting, officially located in the fictional state of Delmarva, carries all of that in its background art. You can feel the humidity in the backgrounds. You can feel the smallness of the town, the way everyone knows everyone, the way the same families have run the same businesses for decades. Steven Sugar, Rebecca's brother, the lead background designer, the person the show's main character is named for, built Beach City with a precision that the show then used as a canvas for something it never explicitly acknowledged. The humans of Beach City are living next to an ongoing alien conflict, and they have been for as long as anyone alive can remember, and most of them have never really processed what that means. The Fryman family runs the fry shop. The pizza family runs the pizza restaurant. Sadie and Lars work at the Big Donut. Jamie the mailman delivers mail. Nanefua is a grandmother who was born in Beach City, raised children in Beach City, and watched alien ships appear in the sky over it on at least 2 separate occasions. Mayor Dewey ran the town for most of the series and responded to alien crises by getting in a municipal van and driving away, leaving a recorded message encouraging his constituents to take care of themselves. Ronaldo Fryman is the conspiracy theorist. He runs a blog called Keep Beach City Weird and has been documenting paranormal activity in the area for years: the lights over the beach, the strange beings who live in the temple, the evidence of events that don't fit any conventional framework. He is played largely for comedy. He is also almost entirely correct. He knows something is happening. He just doesn't have the context to interpret it. And no one, not the Crystal Gems, not Steven, not the adults in Beach City who have watched this for longer than Ronaldo has been alive, tells him what the context is. Whether this is because they've decided the truth would be too much for him, or because they don't think he deserves to know, or because the Crystal Gems have simply never felt the obligation to explain themselves to the humans of the town they live next to, the show doesn't say. What it does do is present Ronaldo's exclusion from the truth with enough detail that you can read it as a commentary on how power works. The beings with extraordinary capabilities decide who gets information. The humans who live in the fallout zone of those capabilities don't necessarily get a vote. Connie Maheswaran is the exception. She crosses fully into the gem world, not because she was born into it, she wasn't, but because she chose to. She trained with Pearl. She learned to sword fight. She fused with Steven to become Stevani, the first human gem fusion, a being who moves through the world with a freedom and a beauty that transcends the category either of them fits into individually. Her parents had to eventually reckon with the fact that their daughter had been training as a magical warrior. The reckoning happened in the episode Nightmare Hospital, with real weight and without easy resolution. But the broader population of Beach City never gets that reckoning. They watch fusion battles from their windows. They see alien ships in the sky. They see gem architecture along the beach that has been there since before any of their grandparents were born. And then the pizza shop opens and the big donut serves customers and the mechanic fixes cars and Beach City goes on, because what else would it do? There's a reading of this as gentle comedy, the cartoon logic of human beings adapting to extraordinary circumstances through sheer normative inertia. And that reading is valid. The show knows what it's doing when Ronaldo's conspiracy board features evidence that anyone with access to the crystal gems would immediately recognize. It's funny because it's absurd. But there's another reading, which is that Beach City's relationship to the gem world is the show's version of a question it raises throughout its run. What happens to the people who live in proximity to power but don't have access to it? What do the residents of a town that has been adjacent to an ancient alien conflict for generations know about that conflict? What does it do to a community to grow up in the shadow of something extraordinary you've never been told about? The show built Beach City large enough to contain people with full inner lives. Sadie's ambition and frustration, Lars's self-deception and eventual transformation, Vidalia and Yellowtail's marriage, Nanafua's dignity, Mayor Dewey's cowardice, and then set all of these lives against a background of ongoing alien crisis and let the two exist side by side without fully reconciling them. That's probably closer to reality than any tidy reconciliation would have been. Communities near military bases, near industrial disasters, near anything powerful and potentially dangerous, they develop a complicated relationship with the thing they live next to. Not ignorance, exactly, and not knowledge, exactly. Something in between. A kind of adaptive unawareness that lets ordinary life continue. What happens to Beach City after Steven leaves is, like most of the show's future projections, left genuinely open. The crystal gems are still there. Bismuth has set up a forge. Little homeschool has continued. Gems and humans are, in the show's vision of Era 3, beginning the slow process of learning to exist together in something other than the context of a war. Beach City, which has been adjacent to the gem world longer than any gem community has been adjacent to the human one, might be where that coexistence first becomes truly ordinary. The boardwalk will probably still be there. The Big Donut, under whatever management, will probably still be serving. The Crystal Temple will still be at the end of the beach with its two stone faces looking out over the water. And Lion will probably still be on the front steps, enormous and pink and keeping his secrets, aging very slowly, watching the ocean the way he has watched it for a couple of centuries at least. Beach City is the human side of the show's argument, the case that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, in proximity to the extraordinary, become something richer and stranger and more resilient than either the ordinary or the extraordinary alone would produce. The show made it feel like a real place because it needed to be a real place. The lore requires a location. The love story requires somewhere to happen. The long, ongoing, never-quite-finished work of healing requires a home to heal into. And so Beach City exists, on the coast of Delmarva, in a state that isn't quite any real state, in a world that's ours but also isn't. With a magical temple at one end of the beach and an ocean at the other, And a kid who grew up there who had a gem in his stomach and saved the world and then drove away in a van because saving the world turned out not to be the same as saving himself? And because some kinds of saving require a road and a friend and time and the willingness to not have a destination yet, the town is there. It holds what it holds. Whatever the shore keeps, it keeps quietly. The shape of everything. Pull back from all of it. Hold it all together for a moment. The gem civilization began somewhere in the deep past with White Diamond establishing a philosophy of perfection that became a machine for harm. Pink Diamond was born into that civilization and grew into someone who wanted something different and found a way to be different by becoming someone else, paying costs to other people who hadn't agreed to pay them. Pearl spent thousands of years carrying secrets she hadn't consented to carry, and grief she hadn't consented to feel, and then spent more years, slowly, carefully, building a self that could hold more than devotion. Garnet existed as the impossible proof that the rules were wrong, and kept existing, and kept choosing Ruby and Sapphire across 5,750 years. Lapis was caught in a war she had nothing to do with, and spent 5,000 years imprisoned by it, and emerged damaged and powerful, and slowly, haltingly finding something like ground. Bismuth asked a real question and got sealed away for millennia, and the question is still there, unresolved. Spinel waited 6,000 years for someone who never came back, and then found people who were genuinely glad to see her. The corrupted gems spent thousands of years in monstrous forms until a boy with a pink gem in his stomach brought 3 diamonds together long enough to undo what they'd done. And Steven grew up and paid costs and learned that saving everyone does not protect you from yourself, and started going to therapy and drove away from the town where he'd grown up towards something he hadn't defined yet. All of these stories share a structure. They're about what gets passed down without consent. The things you inherit from the people who came before you, their secrets, their wars, their loves, their damage, their capacity for change. Pink Diamond passed her gem and her power and her uncompleted history to Steven. Rose passed her decisions and their consequences to everyone she loved. White Diamond passed a philosophy of perfection to an entire civilization. Garnet passed the proof that love is real to a boy who needed to see it. Steven Universe is a show about inheritance, ultimately, about what the generation before you leaves in your hands and what you choose to do with it. About whether you can love the people who gave you what you carry, even when what they gave you was also a burden. About whether you can be angry at them, genuinely angry, and still move forward. And about whether moving forward requires you to know everything, or whether some things belong to the people who lived them, and you carry what you carry, and you put down what you can, and you keep going. The show is still there whenever you want to go back to it. 5 seasons, a film, a limited series, hundreds of episodes, more songs than you've probably counted. Beach City is on the coast somewhere in the fictional Delmarva, and the Crystal Temple is lit against the sky, and the ocean makes its sounds, reliable and ongoing. Whatever you came here carrying tonight, set it down for a while. The shore holds things for you while you rest. If this kind of deep dive is the thing that finds you at the right hour, slow, careful, spending as long as it needs to spend on the things worth spending time on, then subscribe. There'll be more. More shows built with layers. More lore that rewards attention. More quiet hours talking about the things that were made with love and the people who loved them. Sleep well. See you in the next one. End of script. Addendum. The smaller threads details the show planted and couldn't quite finish. There is a whole category of Steven Universe lore that sits below the level of major arc, the kind of detail you notice on a 3rd or 4th watch that the show never had time to follow up on properly. These aren't failures every long-form narrative leaves threads behind, and the measure of a world is whether those threads feel like things that exist beyond the edges of the story rather than mistakes that got dropped. Steven Universe passes that test comfortably. What follows is a tour through some of the smaller, quieter pieces that reward attention. The Other Amethysts. The prime kindergarten, carved into the cliffs of what would become northeastern North America, produced a large number of amethysts during the Earth colonization project. Our amethyst, the one who grew up alongside Steven, who wrestles with feeling like she came out wrong, who is too small and too chaotic and too everything that Homeworld would call defective, was the last of them, and she emerged 500 years late, long after the war ended and the other amethysts had been evacuated. But the show confirms that there are many other amethysts, A group of them appear in Season 3, serving as guards at Pink Diamond Zoo on the homeworld moon. They're bigger than our amethyst, the standard size for that gem type, and they've spent the last 5,000 years working in the zoo, maintaining the habitat for the human's blue diamond collected there in Pink's memory. They're decent. They're reasonably kind within the constraints of their job. They have developed their own culture in that isolated outpost, their own small rituals and in-jokes, their own way of doing things. Our amethyst's encounter with them is one of the show's most emotionally precise moments, because she spends most of the series feeling like she's not enough of what an amethyst should be. And then she meets a group of genuine, standard-spec amethysts, and they look at her, and instead of confirming her worst fears about herself, they are thrilled. She's an Earth amethyst. She's legendary. The beta kindergarten amethysts, who appear much later as soldiers, made in a rush during the war, grown in shallow holes, and coming out of it with various asymmetries and irregularities, speak of the prime kindergarten amethysts with a kind of reverence. The prime kindergarten was Pink Diamond's first colony. The gems made there are part of gem history. Our amethyst was never less than what she was supposed to be. She was exactly what Earth made her, and Earth made her wonderful. The show delivers that in stages across multiple seasons, and it never loses the weight of it. The zoo amethyst's lives after the zoo's humans are given the choice to leave, and after Era 3 begins, that's one of those threads that just ends at the edge of the frame. They presumably returned to Homeworld or found somewhere else. They presumably had to reckon with the fact that the zoo they maintained for thousands of years was, in hindsight, not exactly something to be proud of. Whether they were given time and space to process that, whether the gems who had lived their entire existence maintaining a human habitat for Blue Diamond's grief experienced something like liberation or something like loss, when that function ended, the show doesn't follow. Peridot's arc and the limits of what certainty permits. Peridot deserves more than a footnote. She arrives in Season 1 as a homeworld technician sent to check on the cluster project's small, precise, efficient, deeply contemptuous of organic life and of the crystal gem's entire existence, armed with limb enhancers that make her significantly more powerful than her baseline Peridot equipment would suggest. She is, at first encounter, a straightforward antagonist, sharp-tongued, superior, dismissive. Over the course of Seasons 2 and 3, she becomes something else entirely. The slow transformation of Peridot from adversary to crystal gem is one of the show's quietest achievements, not because it happens fast, it doesn't, but because it happens through accumulation rather than through single moments of conversion. She learns to use a tablet. She watches Camp Pining Hearts with Lapis and develops opinions about it. She starts to understand that what Homeworld told her was true about the value of different kinds of life and different ways of existing wasn't the complete picture. She makes something with Lapis that they call Meep Morp abstract art, and discovers that making things for no purpose other than the making of them is not, in fact, pointless. The moment Peridot calls Yellow Diamond a clod on a live transmission and then panics about it is the moment her arc becomes irreversible. She has said what she actually thinks to the authority she was made for, and she can't take it back. From that point, she is genuinely herself, which turns out to include being genuinely terrified, and genuinely brave, and genuinely invested in the Earth in a way she hadn't expected to become. Her gem, it turns out, has a latent power she never knew about. She can manipulate metal through a magnetic adjacent ability that Homeworld Peridots apparently used to have, and have since lost through breeding changes to the gem type over the eras. This is a small but rich lore detail. It implies that the gem types have been actively shaped and reshaped over the course of Homeworld's history, that what a Peridot is has changed across time, and that individual variation and capacity exist within gem types in ways that Homeworld's caste system actively suppresses. Peridot can do something that no modern Peridot is supposed to be able to do because she is older, by gem standards, than the version of Peridot the current system produces. By the show's end, Peridot is living in a barn, growing vegetables, making art, and teaching at Little Homeschool. She's a crystal gem. She's enthusiastic about humans in the specific way of someone who spent centuries believing organic life was irrelevant and then discovered it was extraordinary. What her life looks like in Era 3, what role she plays in the ongoing process of gem-human relationship, What she makes and who she makes it with the show leaves this for your imagination. But the imagination has good material to work with. Lars and the weight of an accidental transformation. Lars Barriga's arc is one of the more extraordinary things the show quietly accomplished across its run. He starts as the insecure teenager who works at the Big Donut and is unkind to Steven in the specific way of someone who feels small and takes it out on whoever is nearby. He wants to be cool. He wants to be accepted by the cool kids. He is, at the series' start, not particularly likable. He ends the series as a person who died in space, was resurrected by Steven's healing tears, became pink and magical and portal-bearing, and ageless in the way that Lion is, and led a crew of outcast gems on a journey home from the far side of the galaxy. What the resurrection cost Lars and what it gave him are both worth spending time on. He can't eat anymore. His body doesn't need organic sustenance in the way it used to. He ages so slowly as to be functionally immortal by human standards. His hair is a portal to Lion's dimension, which connects him to Lion in a way neither of them seems entirely sure how to process. When Lars finally comes home after months in space leading the off-colors, growing into confidence and capability, and a selfhood that the small beach city world he'd grown up in hadn't given him room for. There's a moment of reunion that the show plays quietly and correctly. The scene between Lars and Lion is one of those moments. They look at each other. Two beings resurrected by the same power, both pink and ageless, both carrying dimensional portals in their anatomies. The show doesn't narrate what that means. It just lets them be in proximity and leaves you to feel the weight of the connection. What Lars does next is genuinely uncertain. He's back at the Big Donut, but he is not the person who left. He is a person who has seen other star systems and led companions through danger and grown into leadership and come home to find that the town he grew up in is small in a way it didn't used to be, though still dear. He presumably still doesn't age. He presumably eventually has to reckon with what it means to outlive everyone he grew up with. The show doesn't go there, it ends before Lars's lifespan becomes the concern, but the lore of what Lars Barriga is now makes his future one of the most genuinely unusual in any animated series. He's also the only human in the main series who directly experienced what it means to be a gem in some sense, the death and resurrection, the changed biology, the new relationship to time and mortality. He's a bridge in a very literal sense, a person who has been transformed by the same force that makes the crystal gems what they are. What he does with that, in a beach city that is itself slowly becoming a place where gems and humans coexist, seems like the beginning of something worth following. The zoo and the question of 6,000 years of captivity. Blue Diamond built the zoo in the aftermath of the Gem War, in the aftermath of Pink Diamond's supposed death, as an act of preservation and grief. She took humans from Earth roughly 6,000 years ago, the show implies, based on the age of the human habitat and the accumulated generations of descendants within it, and placed them in a perfectly managed environment on a moon. The environment is beautiful, green, temperate, safe. The humans who live there have never known anything outside it. They have developed their own culture, their own rituals, their own understanding of what life is and how it works. They have no concept of the word outside. The universe beyond their habitat doesn't exist for them in any meaningful sense. When Steven and the Crystal Gems discover the zoo and interact with the humans there in the Season 4 storyline, there is a careful, strange quality to the encounter. The zoo humans are not unhappy. They're not suffering in any way that they can perceive. They have food, shelter, safety, each other. They have a system called the Choosening for selecting partners. They have their names, given to them by Homeworld, which don't match any human naming conventions because Homeworld didn't ask. The humans of the zoo have lived this way for dozens of generations. They are the descendants of people who were taken, and they have never been told. Greg, who ends up in the zoo briefly, is the first person from the outside world these humans have ever met. The effect is disorienting for everyone. He doesn't know the customs. He says things that don't make sense in the context they've been raised in. He has a concept of self-determination that their environment doesn't accommodate. And eventually, the humans of the zoo are given a choice. Leave or stay. Some of them leave. Some of them presumably stay. The show doesn't follow the ones who leave. What does it mean to be a human descended from humans who were taken from Earth 6,000 years ago? To go to Earth as someone who has never been there and whose ancestors hadn't been there either within any living or recorded memory? The zoo humans carry 6,000 years of removed history. They carry names given by alien custodians. They carry a culture evolved in captivity that is distinctly theirs and is also the product of captivity. The show acknowledges this, briefly, and then moves on. Because there isn't time, and because some things are too big to be completed within the space of a narrative that has other stories to tell. This is, in some ways, the show's most pointed, unresolved question about historical harm. The Gem civilization took people from Earth. The people are now real, with real lives and real identities, and the context of how they got there doesn't negate the realness of who they became. What do you owe people in that situation? What does healing look like for a community whose captivity extended across 60 centuries and whose descendants may not fully understand what was taken? The show raises this and can't complete it, because completing it honestly would require a different kind of story than the one Steven Universe was built to tell. The fandom that built a second text. Any honest account of Steven Universe lore has to acknowledge the fandom as part of the story. Because what happened between the show and its audience across the years it was airing was genuinely unusual, not unprecedented in animated television, but specific in its intensity and its consequence. The Steven Universe fandom was, at its height, one of the most analytically sophisticated communities in online animation discussion. They built detailed timelines from fragmentary evidence. They cataloged background color changes across seasons and built theories from the patterns. They noticed that the ending theme credits music was accumulating new verses, figured out the structural logic of it, and were able to predict the complete song before it was publicly performed. They observed that Garnet's 3 eyes and visible twin gems appeared in early season episodes before the jailbreak reveal and built careful arguments about what the show was leaving in plain sight for those who were looking. When A Single Pale Rose aired in May 2018, the episode that confirmed what many in the fandom had theorized for years, that rose quartz was pink diamond, it landed into a conversation that had been happening for a long time. Fan theories had been building a case with evidence from scattered episodes across multiple seasons. Some of the most detailed fan analyses, created years before the reveal, had correctly identified not just the conclusion but some of the specific supporting evidence. The reveal confirmed the attentiveness of a fandom that the show had trained to pay attention. This relationship between the show and its audience changed what the show was, in a meaningful sense. The fan theorizing created a second text, an ongoing interpretive layer that the creative team was aware of and sometimes responded to, that shaped how the show's revelations landed. That created a community of mutual meaning-making around a piece of art. The unresolved questions feel different because of this. They aren't just narrative gaps. They're gaps in an ongoing conversation between the show and people who loved it enough to read it on every level they could find. Rebecca Sugar has spoken in various contexts about making the show for queer young people, for people who felt like they didn't fit the categories the world offered them. That intention is visible in every system. The show built in the Gemcast system as a metaphor for how humans categorize each other, in the off-colors as a portrait of people who exist outside the categories and survive anyway, in Garnet as the literal embodiment of a love that the dominant society said shouldn't exist, but that exists anyway, and keeps existing, and keeps being real. The fandom that built up around those ideas was, in many cases, made up of people who saw themselves reflected in them. People for whom the show's central argument that you are allowed to exist as you are, that the world's classifications of what's acceptable or defective don't determine your worth, was not an abstract proposition, but a personal one. The lore mattered because the lore was underneath the gems and the aliens and the magic shields, about the specific experience of being something the world hadn't been designed for. The final geometry of it all. Here's what stays with you, if you let it. A very small boy in a pink t-shirt, in a house attached to a cliff, looking at the ocean. He has a magical gem in his stomach that he didn't ask for, and some powers he hasn't figured out yet, and a mother who is gone in a way that isn't quite dying. He has 3 ancient alien warriors who love him in their particular, complicated ways. He has a dad who plays music and lives in a van. He has a town full of people who have grown up next to magic without ever quite becoming magical themselves. And the show puts all of this together, the galaxy-spanning history, the ancient wars, the philosophy of perfection versus the reality of mess and love and change, and delivers it through this kid's eyes. through the particular way that a child in the midst of an extraordinary life is always simultaneously the most important person in that life and the least equipped to understand its full context. Steven spends the series slowly uncovering the context. Episode by episode, season by season, the history of his world comes into focus. A diamond who didn't want to be a diamond, who became someone else but couldn't fully escape who she was, who left behind a child and a gem and a set of consequences neither she nor anyone else had fully accounted for. The whole show is Steven's education in that context, conducted through experience rather than instruction, because the people who could instruct him are either gone or constrained by what they're allowed to say. And by the end of Future, by the ending scene of Steven getting in a van and driving away from Beach City, he knows enough. Not everything, not all of it. The chest and lion's dimension that opened in the film and was never addressed, the full truth of Centipedal's relationship with Rose, the origin of the Diamond Authority, the complete accounting of the corruption's human gem cost, these things remain unknown. They remain part of the world the show built, but couldn't finish mapping. But Steven knows enough to go. He knows who he is. He knows what he carries. He knows that carrying it doesn't mean being crushed by it, and that putting some of it down doesn't mean abandoning the people he got it from. He drives away. The show ends. Beach City stays on the coast. The lore keeps going in the minds of the people who spent years reading it carefully and loving it and carrying it. That's what happens to every world that was built large enough to mean something. It keeps going past the edges of the frame. It extends into the space where the audience brings their own questions and sits with the ones that don't have answers. The show is still there. It'll be there in the morning and the morning after that. Sleep well. The ocean isn't going anywhere. And if you've made it to the end of this, thank you for staying. If this is the kind of content you want more of, long form, unhurried, the kind that rewards the hour between midnight and 1 in the morning, then subscribe. Drop a comment. Tell me what thread from the show you still think about. I read them all. Good night. The Architecture of Compassion, What the Show Built, and Why It Lasted. Steven Universe sits in a specific moment in animated television history, and it's worth understanding that moment to understand what the show accomplished within it. It aired between 2013 and 2019 years, that saw a genuine shift in what animated series aimed at younger audiences were allowed to address, in terms of emotional complexity, thematic weight, and the representation of identities and relationships that had been largely absent from the medium. Steven Universe didn't just exist in this shift. It was one of its engines. Rebecca Sugar was the first solo female creator in Cartoon Network's history. That fact carries more implications than it might immediately seem. It meant that the show had a single, sustained creative vision at its core, across its entire run. A sensibility that came from one person's specific experiences and relationships and artistic influences. The show about a boy whose mother gave up her form to bring him into the world, who grows up trying to understand who she was and what she meant by what she left him, was made by someone who grew up drawing fantasy stories with her younger brother, and then made a character named after that brother the protagonist of her first show. The show about the weight of inheritance was made by someone who understood inheritance from the inside. Ian Jones-Quartey, who worked on the first 3 seasons before leaving to create his own show, was the co-developer and a significant shaping presence in the show's early DNA. He and Sugar married in 2019. The Crystal Gems, as a found family of beings who chose each other across thousands of years, who have complex and sometimes painful relationships but who fundamentally hold on, carries the weight of the people who made it. The show's design philosophy was built around legibility and emotional clarity expressed through visual language. Character designer Danny Hines, drawing influence from the clean, iconic quality of 1940s Disney character design, wanted every crystal gem to be immediately readable in silhouette. And they are Pearl's sharp angles and precise posture, Amethyst's compact roundness, Garnet's wide-shouldered strength, Steven's soft central circle, and Star Shirt. But within that legibility, the show built an enormous amount of subtlety. The way Pearl holds herself changes season by season as her grief evolves. The way Amethyst's posture shifts around different characters tells you about how safe or unsafe she feels in each dynamic. The way Garnet's stability is a kind of stillness that only breaks in very specific moments of emotional overwhelm, these are things you feel watching the show long before you consciously articulate them. The backgrounds deserve their own extended attention. In children's animation, backgrounds are often functional, they establish location, and keep things recognizable. In Steven Universe, backgrounds are doing additional work. The warmth or coolness of the color palette tells you something about the emotional register of the scene. The stability or instability of the geometry in homeworld environments versus Earth environments signals the difference between rule-governed rigidity and organic livingness. The Crystal Temple, with its asymmetrical architecture and its strange combination of natural rock and magical construction, looks like a home that grew around the people in it over thousands of years because the show wanted it to look like exactly that. The kindergartens are stark and pale with dead earth and jagged rock formations, and they look like wounds. They look like what they are, places from which life was extracted. This is not accidental. Guy Davis, who designed the early gem architecture and monsters, created structures that feel alien in a specific way, not the sleek, technological alien of most science fiction, but something older and stranger, mineral rather than mechanical. The gem world's architecture is carved and crystalline and enormous in a way that makes human architecture look provisional by comparison, and the character arcs are built with the same care as the visual language. Think about the structure of Amethyst's growth across the series. She starts in Season 1 as the chaotic, fun-seeking, slightly careless gem who doesn't seem to take things seriously. What slowly becomes clear is that the chaos and the humor are management strategies. She emerged from the kindergarten 500 years late, alone, into a post-war Earth with no context for who she was supposed to be. She grew in a place designed to produce soldiers for a war that was already over. She's been improvising her own identity for the entirety of her existence, and the improvisational quality of her personality is the coping mechanism that improvisation produces. Her arc reaches its most concentrated moment in the episode Tiger Philanthropist, where she finally retires her wrestling alter ego, Tiger Millionaire, a character she'd played as an escape valve, a way of being powerful and successful and celebrated in a context where those things felt safe because they were fictional. When she retires it, it's because she's found other ways to feel good about who she is. Not a dramatic transformation, just a slow accumulation of self-knowledge that eventually makes the escape valve unnecessary. That's what the show's character arcs look like when they're working properly. Not moment of conversion, but gradual, real, earned change. The fusion mechanic as both storytelling device and metaphor is the most fully developed idea in the show and the one that rewards the most sustained attention. Every fusion in the series tells you something about the relationship that created it. Opal Pearl and Amethyst is graceful and powerful, but unstable, reflecting the fact that Pearl and Amethyst have real affection for each other, but also real tension, and Opal tends to diffuse at moments of conflict between her components. Sugilite Garnet and Amethyst is enormous and aggressive and loses herself in the power of the combination, which is exactly what happens when Garnet's stability and Amethyst's chaos meet each other without enough mindfulness of the relationship. Sardonyx, Garnet, and Pearl is theatrical and precise and genuinely delightful, the product of two personalities whose very different natures find a complementary expression in each other. And then there's Stevonnie, Steven, and Connie, who is the show's most explicit argument about what fusion actually means. Stevonnie is neither Steven nor Connie. Stevonnie is taller than either, moves differently from either, has access to something neither of them has alone. And Stevonnie is genderqueer. The show presents Stevonnie with she, they pronouns used interchangeably, the first genderqueer character in a Cartoon Network series. This was deliberate and specific and came with consequences in terms of what various international broadcasts of the show were willing to air without editing. The choice to make a human gem fusion the show's genderqueer character is a choice that speaks to the whole mythology. Gems are agender, they are addressed with feminine pronouns as a convention, but exist outside of biological sex, and their genders are as constructed as everything else about their projected forms. When a human fuses with a gem, what emerges is something that exists genuinely outside the binary that human culture imposes. Stevonnie is neither the categories the human world would put Steven in, nor the categories it would put Connie in. Stevonnie is the person they are together, and that person is their own category. This is what the show does at its best. It takes the specific vocabulary of its world gems, fusion, forms that are chosen rather than given, and uses them to say things about human experience that would be more difficult to say in a purely realistic setting. The gem world's mythology is a lens, and Rebecca Sugar knew exactly what she wanted the lens to show. The show also did something that bears remarking on. It let its villains be wrong about themselves as well as about the world. Yellow Diamond's efficiency and impatience aren't just character flaws, they're a coping mechanism for grief she won't let herself feel. Blue Diamond's overwhelming sadness isn't just characterization, it's what happens to a being of enormous power who has never been offered any tools for processing loss other than more power. White Diamond's insistence on perfection is the architecture of a being who is, underneath all the authority, terrified of something the show gestures toward but never fully explains, which is why she retreated and why she needs to control everything, and why the specific imperfection that Pink Diamond represented was so threatening to her. These are recognizable emotional states. Everyone who has ever dealt with grief by working harder, or by crying so much it leaked into the people around them, or by insisting so fiercely on control that they couldn't acknowledge the ways things were already out of hand, those viewers recognize something in the Diamonds. The show gave you alien rulers of an intergalactic empire whose inner lives were essentially human, and it did so without collapsing into sentimentality or simplicity. They caused enormous harm. They also had reasons for the ways they were. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the show didn't use one to excuse the other. The finale's redemption of the Diamonds is sometimes questioned. It happens quickly, and quickly is a real criticism. But the show's argument is ultimately not that the Diamonds became good in one conversation. It's that Steven's willingness to see them clearly, to insist on their capacity for change, to refuse to treat them as simply monsters, opened something that wasn't open before. The change that followed was theirs to make or not make. He just gave them the possibility. The rest was theirs. This is the show's deepest argument, the one it makes across its entire run from the very beginning to the very end. The willingness to genuinely see another person is not a weakness. It is, in fact, the most transformative force available to anyone. Not because it guarantees a result, but because it creates a condition in which results become possible that weren't possible before. Steven's superpower, the one that matters more than the shield or the healing tears or the ability to fuse with humans, is his capacity to look at someone who is causing harm and ask, genuinely and without contempt, what happened to them that made them this way? That's a radical proposition in a world, the animated world, the children's media world, the entertainment world generally, where the villain's function is generally to be defeated. Steven Universe kept asking what the villain would become if they were seen instead of just defeated. And it built a mythology capable of answering that question. Beach City is still on the coast. The Crystal Temple is still lit against the sky. The ocean is still constant. Whatever questions the show left unanswered, and there are real ones, good ones, ones worth turning over in the quiet hours, they sit within a world that was built with genuine love and genuine intention, and a genuine desire to make something that would help the people watching it feel less alone in the particular ways they were alone. The show did that. Whatever else it left unfinished, it did that. And that's worth sitting with for a moment, before you sleep. Something was made with care, for you, and it's still there. The lore keeps, the world holds. Sleep well. One last thing, because we're not in a rush. There is a moment in the episode Lion 3, straight to video, the third episode ever made about Lion, which is one of the stranger recurring motifs of the show's title design, where Steven is in the Big Donut watching Rose's VHS tape on a borrowed player. Lars is there, being awkward. Sadie is there, being kind in the particular way she is kind. And Steven watches his mother on the television screen, this ancient alien being thousands of years old, fiddling with a camera and not quite knowing how it works. She says, "Is it on?" Several times. She checks the viewfinder. She adjusts the angle. She is, in that moment, not the great revolutionary leader of the Crystal Gems. She is not Pink Diamond in disguise. She is not the ancient ruler of an empire or the woman who started a war or the person who left so many people carrying so much. She is just someone trying to figure out how to say goodbye to a person she hasn't met yet on a machine she doesn't know how to use. And then she figures it out, and she looks at the camera. And she says she is practicing, as if the right words might come if she just tries again. As if the right way to say this might exist if she keeps looking for it. She makes the tape. It is imperfect, and it is incomplete, and it is what she had. and then she stopped existing, and it became what Steven had. All of the lore in Steven Universe, every backstory and every revelation and every slowly revealed consequence, is in some way a form of that tape. Someone tried to leave something for whoever came after them. They got it wrong in some ways, and they got it right in some ways, and they ran out of time before they could say everything. The chest in Lion's dimension that opened, and nobody saw inside. The garden full of forget-me-nots. The compelled silence that lasted millennia. The broken sword in the background of the movie. All of it is someone practicing. All of it is the imperfect residue of lives that mattered. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. Worth sitting with. Worth watching again whenever the night is quiet and the world feels like it needs something soft. The show is there. The lore keeps. The ocean doesn't stop. Good night.